All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for the weekly Saving Life on Earth webinar. I'm Tiara Curry. I'm a senior scientist at the center, and people are always asking us, what can I do to help fight the extinction crisis and the climate emergency? Probably the most common question we get when we're out giving talks and going to conferences. And the answer is fight for better policy and do everything you can as an individual to make a difference. But today we're excited to talk about our fight for better, more sustainable, equitable food policies and the huge difference individuals can make with their dietary choices. First, a few technical notes. We did not disable the chat bar today, even though we heard from a lot of you that it's distracting. We were having technical trouble, so we didn't disable it, but we're asking you not to use it, or if you do, to please be respectful and stay relevant. And if you have questions, put them in the questions feature, because at the end we'll have 15 or 20 minutes to answer your questions. If we don't get to all of them today, Stephanie and I will be on Slack tomorrow in the Mobilized for the Wild Endangered Species channel from 12 to 1 to answer more of your questions. Or you can shoot any of the panelists an email by finding their information on our website. Tomorrow, you'll get an email that has a link to the video from today that has an action alert that you can take to make a difference in fighting for better food policy. And it'll have instructions on how to join Slack if that's something that you want to do and you don't know how yet. So we're happy that you're here. And with that, I'll let our panelists introduce themselves. Jennifer, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Jennifer Molidor. I'm the Senior Food Campaigner, and I run the Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign.
Good afternoon. I'm JP Rose. I'm a staff attorney at the center based in Los Angeles, and I'm in the Urban Wildlands program.
Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie Feldstein. I'm the Population and Sustainability Director here at the Center, and it's good to be on another webinar with you all.
If you were on last week, you remember Stephanie from last week, and she was kind enough to join us 2 weeks in a row. So, well, let's start with the very basics. Jennifer, what does diet have to do with saving the planet?
So diet is so inherently connected with the work that we want to do to protect the environment. And I'm going to give you some statistics, but a lot of more information is available if you're interested to visit our website, either our main site at biologicaldiversity.org or takeextinctionoffyourplate.com. So global warming and biodiversity loss present the gravest threat to life on Earth. Not only is meat production eliminating habitat, reducing food resources, and causing drought, but animal agriculture is 16.5% of human-induced global greenhouse gas emissions. 175 endangered species are imperiled by public lands grazing. Livestock grazing impacts half of endangered wild plants and animals. And Wildlife Services, which is a federal program with the USDA, shoots, traps, and poisons millions of the animals that we're fighting so hard to protect, including wolves, foxes, bears, prairie dogs, and everything in between for livestock. So if you care about those animals, taking note of your diet is one really important way to do that. The land used for feed crops and grazing multiplies the footprint of meat, right? So it's not just the animals grazing, but the feed crops and everything else as well that comes along with it. In addition to that, 80% of agricultural land is used for raising animals, and more than half of the grain grown in the country goes to livestock. In fact, nearly half of the water used goes towards meat production as well. So this is a big deal. Changing what we eat is one of the most powerful individual ways you can take to protect the environment that we all love. And so, for example, just to give you some idea of the scale of how impactful this is to make individual actions, cutting half of the meat and dairy from your diet can save as much as 500,000 gallons of water, more than 6,000 square feet of land, and the greenhouse gas equivalent of driving 4,000 miles less per year. In fact, if you want to picture it this way collectively, if every American eliminated meat just one night a week, every American just one night a week, the emissions savings would be like taking 30 to 40 million cars off the road for a year, right? So our work in all of our other programs, all the work that you're supporting, whether it's protecting wolves, protecting public lands and so on, protecting biodiversity, is amplified by changing our diets or considering what we eat and how we eat. And I think as we'll talk about further in this format and down the road, changing our diets and considering our diets in the way that we eat and the way that meat is produced particularly can also prevent and limit the spread of further pandemics.
So it makes sense to me that if I don't eat meat, that I'm helping prevent animal cruelty and stop pollution and like stop factory farms and slaughterhouses like we talked about last week. But as one person, if I stop eating meat, does that really help combat global climate change?
Yes, it does. There's been a lot of research out there making the connection between dietary change and fighting climate change. Like we know from what Jennifer just told us that the food system as a whole has a huge impact on the environment and more broadly and on the climate. But researchers have found, and this includes the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've found that we can't meet global targets for the reductions that are needed in emissions to avoid catastrophic climate change if we don't address diet, if we don't change the way that we eat. And they have looked at just changing the way that we produce food, and there definitely are some impacts that need to be addressed in the actual production of food, but what we eat is also critically important in this fight against climate change. And so that then comes back to us because there's a huge difference when you look at climate action between some of the other major issues that we deal with and diet. Like with energy, you walk into a room and you turn on the light, oftentimes you don't have a whole lot of choice of where that energy has come from. It's almost purely dictated by policy, even down to whether solar is available or affordable in your area. But for most of us, we don't get to choose our utilities. But at least 3 times a day, you get to choose what you eat. So when we're talking about shifting diets, we're talking specifically about what's happening with individuals. And to talk a little bit more about exactly how big that impact could be, there was new research that just came out earlier this month from University of Michigan and Tulane University that looked at the American diet and what would happen if different eating patterns were carried forward. And one of them that they looked at was a 50% reduction in animal products in the US diet. So that's meat, poultry, dairy, eggs, and animal fats as well. And if half of the US diet, the animal products consumed in the US diet were replaced by plant-based foods, then that would cut individual dietary emissions by 35%. And that's a significant amount. That's why it's often talked about that diet change is one of the most impactful things that we can do as individuals. But the important thing to keep in mind too is that it's not just, that if I ate 50% fewer animal products, that my dietary emissions today would be 35% less. But it's really looking at cumulatively, what does that mean for the whole country and over time? And when they looked at that, they found that those savings would add up to 1.6 billion tons of prevented greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And as I think Jennifer will probably talk about a little bit more later as well, beef is particularly bad for the environment and for the climate. And so if beef was further reduced in this dietary scenario down to 90% less, then there'd be more than 2 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions that were saved. The other flip side of that is that if we don't change our diets, if we continue eating just business as usual here in the US, that by 2030, dietary emissions will rise by 9%, which puts us even further from where we need to be.
So it sounds like individuals can really make a difference. So in terms of policy, the dietary guidelines are currently under review, but most people don't look at the food pyramid or My Plate when they're making dietary choices. So why does it matter that the dietary guidelines are being reviewed?
Well, to start with, is particularly in light of climate change, we need to recognize that all food policy is also climate policy, and the dietary guidelines are part of that. And so it's really important that they recognize sustainable diets. But even though we don't sit down and think about, does our plate look like the little plate on the government's website? What we do think about is the dietary guidelines influence nutrition education. So whether you're seeing a nutritionist as an adult or learning about it as a young child, that is primarily dependent on these government guidelines that are put out. So in a lot of ways, it influences how we think about food as a culture and as individuals, what we think of that makes up a meal, what we think of that's healthy. But even beyond that, the dietary guidelines, they really dictate the purchasing for schools, healthcare institutions, prisons, military facilities. government cafeterias, government programs like Meals on Wheels. So there's a huge amount of purchasing power that goes into the dietary guidelines. So if the dietary guidelines were to recommend less meat and dairy and more plant-based foods, then we would see huge shifts in the market. It also really affects the accessibility of healthy food because of all the programs that are determined by the dietary guidelines, and because the way we think about education and nutrition. This means that the dietary guidelines often determine whether healthy food is available, particularly in underserved neighborhoods, and it can really create more equitable food choices if it's designed to do so. And finally, there's also a lot of policy that's based on the dietary guidelines, since they're seen as really the key to what the government recommends in terms of nutrition. That means there are a whole lot of other food programs and more than $80 billion in federal spending every year that's influenced based on these guidelines. And it's important to note too that the US is behind. There are more than a dozen other countries that have started to implement sustainability in their food guidance, particularly talking about the importance of food policy for not just fighting the climate crisis, but for food security in the future, and that they've adjusted their recommendations accordingly. And we need to do the same here.
So what are some of the other policies that influence what people eat?
Well, one of the big things that we always emphasize when it comes to food policy is that even though we talk about the individual choices that we're all making when we sit down to eat, our choices are really influenced by a lot of external factors, and so many of them are driven by policy. And some of the things that influence it are the availability of food. Like, if I want to eat plant-based foods, it doesn't matter how badly I want that if they're simply not available in stores or in restaurants I go to. Whether those foods are accessible, meaning that are they available in, are we reaching different types of, culturally diverse ways of talking about dietary change? Are foods policies making plant-based foods more affordable or not? Like right now, as a lot of people know, there's a huge amount of subsidies that are driving cheap meat, like meat production and dairy production. They don't have to pay for so many of the costs. That they, the cost to the environment, the cost to health, as well as really some of their baseline costs. They're given a lot of government handouts. And also there are a lot of policies, including the dietary guidelines I was just talking about, that influence how we accept different dietary choices. And whether or not we see what we see as being a sustainable diet. So just to give a couple of quick examples, on the federal level, in addition to the dietary guidelines, we need to shift subsidies so that the subsidies aren't promoting the overproduction of meat and dairy, and that they're not creating artificially cheap meat and dairy, but instead are supporting plant-based foods that are healthier for people and the environment. There are also a lot of federal policies that have to do with what goes into school lunches and whether cafeterias can offer plant-based milks, for example, and what that cost is to them on their very tight budgets. At the state agency, we'd really like to see these cross-agency food policy councils created. And what those can do is when you bring together the folks who are working on environmental and sustainability issues with people who are working on health and nutrition and education, can make sure that really across the board that we're seeing agencies and state programs being aligned on promoting sustainable food, on education campaigns and providing resources. At the state level, there's also a lot that they can do to provide funding and technical support for things like farmers markets and urban agriculture that really make plant-based foods more accessible to more people. And finally, on the local level, there are some really interesting proposals that have put it out there to make plant-based options more available. There was one that was put forth in Los Angeles last year that said that there had to be vegan options available at all major entertainment venues and all facilities that are operated by, by the city. And so that again puts those options in front of people, makes it available for people who want to make that choice, which is really the first step. And another local option is to integrate food into climate action plans. So again, to make food policy as climate policy, to really make sure that climate action plans have specific targets that recognize the importance of promoting more plant-forward diets and reducing meat and dairy consumption. We put a lot of this into a report that was released earlier this month that you can find on our website. If you go to biologicaldiversity.org under the Population and Sustainability Program in the food section, it's called Appetite for Change. And it has more details on these policies that I've talked to, as well as that I've talked about, as well as some others.
So what you're saying is that my choices as an individual might be able to affect positive policy change. Can you tell us more about that, or Jennifer?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a systemic problem, and we need systemic solution, but our individual choices really matter in creating forces that drive that systemic change, right? So create marketplace pressure, and that's going to lead to policy changes. So for example, we're having a lot of plant-based meat alternatives and burgers, and that discussion is going around, and we're seeing that in restaurants and grocery stores, and that's a result of individual pressure being put on the market, and it's having a change as well, and it will down the road affect policy changes. But as Stephanie discussed, you know, other avenues benefit from this pressure, like food service providers, for example, schools. You know, 30 million children across the United States every day are participating at least in the lunch program, and often in the breakfast programs as well. And so creating agreements with food service providers that are more plant forward or earth friendly, wildlife friendly foods can make a difference in 30 million meals a day. And that can be community driven, parent driven, and so on, or activist driven. But that's also true in other avenues, as Stephanie mentioned, whether it's prisons, hotels, anywhere with food service provision. But we're also looking at events, and we're reassessing because of the pandemic, of course, but anywhere an event is held, a conference, for example, including environmental conferences, or aquariums, zoos, museums that have events, really kind of aligning the message and our motivations with the meals and the menus is very important, whether it's COP24, COP25, 26, or just an event at your local museum, for example, that is promoting conservation for wildlife, to have wildlife friendly meals, for example. So creating that, not only that individual pressure on systemic change is important, but really getting the message out too. A lot of people don't make the connection automatically between the wild animals and the wild places that they love and their diets, right? So it might think about cows and pigs, but we don't necessarily think about wolves and bears. And sort of normalizing that is really important as well, so that people have a positive experience with more plant-forward foods and menus and meals, and so that it's also providing balanced meals and taking a little bit of the pressure off individuals making those decisions and just having more options available.
So what does the center serve at events, and does the Center for Biological Diversity have a food policy?
We do have a food policy, and I'm really proud of it, and it means that the center and all of our staff are really walking the talk. And we're one of the few and most bold and outspoken environmental organizations to do so, to be consistent in this way, so that we are serving vegetarian food at all center-sponsored events, whether it's kind of smaller office meetings or our larger organizational gatherings. Aligning that message with the meals that we serve is really important, because food is so important. It plays such an important role in supporting the work that we do across all of our programs. And again, events like that are really, whether it's an office event that maybe our supporters have at their office event annually or whatnot, or a barbecue where you're having people over, or an entire enormous conference. These meals not only normalize the experience, but they make an immediate impact on the climate. So last fall, we released a report called Catering to the Climate, which was very influential on the industry and is available on our website if you want to check it out, which has great comparisons of the emissions and other water use and so forth between common meals that you might have at such an event, that really shows you the enormous impact on an individual level. And also if you magnify that by 5,000 for a large event, or by 100, and you think about all the events across the country, aligning the mission with the menus with earth-friendly, wildlife-friendly food, that gatherings of that kind, which, we're kind of walking away from right now, but gatherings of that kind are really, really impactful for our environment.
So it seems like the elephant in the room for a lot of vegetarians or would-be vegetarians is grass-fed beef. So let's talk about that. Regenerative grazing, do you want to just tell us?
Yeah, so this is a big can of worms here. And so I want to lay it out a little bit so that we're clear what we're talking about. We have grass-fed beef, and then we have regenerative grazing or regenerative agriculture. And those are not necessarily the same things. And yet there's a lot of crossover between them and kind of using of the terms where people might think that they're the same, and they're not. So grass-fed beef is distinguished because it doesn't necessarily come along with the regenerative principles. And that's a problem because it's poorly regulated and it's poorly defined by the industry. So to some degree, grass-fed beef could be anything. It could be beef fed any number of things, and is not the kind of pastoral image that we would think of when we think of cows and pastures and that kind of thing. So putting that aside, that has its own limitations. And talking about regenerative agriculture, certainly, ideally, in an ideal world, we want to work with regenerative principles and livestock operators who are trying to do the right thing, right? Some of the problems with it, though, are thinking about the massive amounts of meat that we eat, particularly beef in this instant. There are reliance upon industrial agriculture. And the idea that we could just swap that out for regenerative grazing is really problematic, right? So there's a study done recently that suggests that if we were to do that, if we were to switch from factory farms to just grazing on the landscape, we could only produce 27% of our current beef supply. So we can't just switch over, but it's more complicated than that. There are issues about, and dialogues and debates, and it gets tense sometimes, about carbon sequestration. So the idea is that you can sequester carbon by, hooves and trampling on the soil and that sort of thing. But it comes along with an increase in methane, right? So there's more of that type of greenhouse gas emission. It also has an impact that a lot of groups or individuals don't consider on wildlife. So that may be in terms of impairing arid landscapes where cows are not necessarily in tune for, or riparian areas that are very delicate and they're impacting the balance of the ecosystem, or direct killing of wildlife is just something that people don't talk about a lot. For livestock, I gave you the example of wildlife services, but there are other services, but that's our federal program. They're using taxpayer dollars to kill millions of animals for livestock operators. So this comes with a big cost deficit that we have to think about. And so the answer isn't necessarily to have one or the other necessarily, but we can't switch to more sustainable forms of the agriculture for raising beef unless we eat a lot less. That's the main conclusion. That has to be first. We have to eat a lot less, and that's going to help not only the production methods, but it's going to help the smaller farmers also as we transition away from factory farms to allow them to have reduced stocking so that they can have these more sustainable principles. So it's a very complex issue, and this is one that is really sensitive for some reason for people, but it's complex for us because it really needs to have the consideration of biodiversity and wildlife. How does this impact wildlife? And so when we talk about transitioning to pastures, for example, we might overlook our need for preserving biodiversity and wildlife there, right? So a pasture is not in itself biodiverse, it's just grass. So we need to think about emissions, we need to think about water use, we need to think about how this impacts wildlife. And the answer is not simple, but the clearest part of the answer is that we need to pretty substantially reduce our beef consumption out of everything. And it also needs to transition to plant-based foods rather than just another form of animal agriculture. And that's going to make a big difference on how we're able to farm and protect our food supply.
So what about eating a local diet? Is eating local the answer?
That's a good question. So, transitioning away from factory farms, for example, is going to include some local aspects. And I think a lot of people, like myself included, are finding in the pandemic, especially, that they're wanting to support community-supported agriculture, CSAs, or local farms. I'm doing that as well. And so certainly local is important, but I want to talk about how it's important and why. Community-driven agriculture is the way of the future, I think, for sure. It's hard to have a CAFO in your backyard, and people on the front line know that all too well. So local is part of it, but plant-based or meat reduction has to be, again, the bigger part of it, or at least the first part of it. Or in other words, we can't just say, and this is a response we get a lot, just go local, right? So the problem with that is that in terms of food miles, the studies have shown that for meat, which is different from produce, for meat, eliminating the food miles by eating local only reduces about 1 to 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions, right? So it's higher for produce, and so we need to keep that in mind as well. But that's not even the main thing. Eating an entirely local diet doesn't compare to reducing your meat when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing your meat makes a substantial higher difference. But beyond that, it also has a bigger impact in terms of reducing land use, water waste, pollution, wildlife killing, as I've talked about. And so the best thing to do is make sure that we are plant forward, which means reducing our meat consumption by, maybe the numbers that Stephanie mentioned, 50% of all meat, 90% of beef, that's ideal. Of course, as I mentioned with the examples, even eliminating meat one night a week has a big impact if we all did that. And so looking at meat reduction and how that can work in your life is going to make a strong impact. Now, following that up with organic and local is also going to be important as well. But we can't leave out the meat reduction because that has to come first.
So in addition to like dietary changes, what can our members do to help?
Well, I can talk a bit about that. Again, in addition, like obviously the dietary changes, we talk a lot about that, and that's really important because that helps really create, what's available in the market. We have a lot of power as consumers to determine what's out there and what's available. But a big part of like our individual changes is also bringing our community into that. You can check out our social media, the population and sustainability team. We talk about food on Twitter at Choose Wild, and on Instagram, we're at Crowded Planet. TakeExtinctionOffYourPlate.com has a lot of creative ideas for recipes and to help you start with where you are. Like Jennifer said, we have, the ideal goal that we're going to is this 50% reduction of all animal products and then 90% reduction of beef. But it really matters, do what you can now. Wherever you can start today, that's where you should start. And, share your recipes with your friends so other people get to see what really good plant-forward eating looks like. When we're able to kind of get together with family and friends again, you can also share the recipes with them in person and talk about what you're eating differently and why you're changing it. That social aspect, that peer-to-peer is huge in turning that individual change into community change. As Tiara mentioned, we're going to be sending out an action alert. It's going to be around the dietary guidelines. The comment period is open through June 10th. So you can send in the action alert. You can also leave a comment directly on regulations.gov. If you search for dietary guidelines, the first thing that comes up is the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and let them know that including sustainability in these next round of the guidelines is really important to you. You can share that policy guide that I mentioned that's on our website, the one called Appetite for Change. Share that with your representatives, whichever ones you're communicating with, whether that's your federal representatives, your state, or your local ones. Let them know there's a lot of really good information in there about why this policy changes are important and what those policy changes can look like. And then finally, as Jennifer talked about, it matters what's served at events and how different organizations like the center are representing their food policies. So tell the organizations that you support and the events that you attend that you want to see plant-based menus and plant-based meal policies. Again, that will help create that that community around shifting toward more sustainable diets, and it'll really can spark that conversation to get more people understanding why this is important and more engaged in the policy around this. And one other thing that we didn't really have time to cover on this particular webinar, but that's a big issue that I know a lot of people think about, is food waste. And that's another area where individual action can make a big difference. A big chunk of the food waste in the US, we waste about 40% of all the food that's produced. And that means that all of the water and land and energy, the pesticides, everything that went into creating that food is just wasted because it never gets eaten. And as individuals, there's a lot that we can do through things like meal planning, through recognizing that date labels are not regulated. So you don't have to throw things out the second it gets near that label on your food. And the only exception to that is infant formula, but everything else, use your senses to determine whether it's still good. We work to urge grocery stores to also commit to zero waste. They do a lot to overstock, and especially as we see now, with the pandemic, the stocking and the demand is really all over the place, and now is a good time for grocery stores and as well as restaurants as they prepare to shift their business models and reopen, to really make that commitment to zero waste and really take a good look at how do they deal with the changing landscape, and how do they really commit to making sure that they are not only not throwing things out in the store, but are supporting farmers to make sure that things are not being wasted on farms as well.
Thanks, Stephanie and Jennifer. And now, some inspiration in the kitchen. We're going to turn it over to attorney JP Rose to teach us how to make something.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my kitchen from Los Angeles. Really excited to be here, and I'm going to be cooking for you some sauteed green beans and lentils. And so this is a recipe I often make maybe in the middle of the week after a long day. If you really don't have like a ton of time to cook, you're maybe a little tired and want something that's healthy, nutritious, and also delicious. So yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And I think there may be a slide with the ingredients you can check out as well if you're interested in making it yourself. So let's start with olive oil. We're going to put just a little bit of olive oil in a medium pan right here and turn this on. Okay. So just about 2 tablespoons roughly, throw that in. Then we're going to add some pureed garlic. And again, roughly 2 tablespoons, but it's really to taste. And obviously, if you prefer to chop up garlic cloves and have them fresh, that's awesome too. I'm just using the pre-made type. And then, so then we're going to put in the green beans. So roughly 12 ounces of organic green beans. Just going to go ahead and throw that in. And then to give them something to kind of marinate with, I'm going to put in the juice of 2 lemons. So I'm just going to chop these up really quick. And then squeeze that in. And one thing I'll mention is that I've been vegetarian for 16 years and vegan for about 5 years. And just especially in the last couple of years, the amount of vegan and vegetarian options at grocery stores, at restaurants, has really increased a lot, which has been awesome. So I would say we're sort of living in like a golden age of veganism, or at least compared to the past. So yeah, there's tons of great non-dairy milks out there, even cheeses, which has been awesome. So squeeze this in, and one more. Okay. Okay. So just going to give that a quick stir. So I think we're just going to let that sit for a couple of minutes, and then if there's questions, we can perhaps go to that and then come back to the next phase. Does that sound good?
Okay, thanks, JP. There's a lot of questions coming in already. So with campaigns that urge meat reduction, do you get pressure, attacks, countersuits from ranchers, meat lobby groups, etc.? Stephanie or Jennifer?
Sure, I can answer that. I know that that's something that a lot of people who get involved in this get concerned with. There was that really big case against Oprah years ago when she started talking about the problems with beef production, and the meat industry came after her. So far, we haven't been directly sued by the meat industry, but they do often attack us in their industry magazines and other industry news outlets. Almost whenever we have a big campaign that goes out, like recently we spearheaded a sign-on letter with more than 50 organizations calling on Congress to not use the COVID stimulus funds as a factory farm bailout, and that certainly got their attention as well. So they're concerned about this. There's a lot of chatter, and they are concerned about the work that we're doing. They're concerned about the increased attention that's being paid to the environmental impact, because they really don't have a whole lot in their defense about how much harder it is on the environment to produce animal products than plant-based foods. But so far there haven't been direct lawsuits against us, and we really do our best, of course, to try to design our campaigns and outreach to avoid that, so that they don't really have a legal leg to stand on.
Thanks, Stephanie. We have a question about access and intersectionality. Not everyone has access to healthy local food. Food deserts are a big issue in low-income people of color communities. What does the center do to address these disparities?
Jennifer, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, that is a really big problem, and it's one reason why we need systemic pressure to change the subsidies to these communities that need more help and have equity and environmental justice as well. So the Latino community in Tucson and the Native community as well, we've been working kind of with local leaders, and we did a pilot project that worked with the food bank, and we did that with the at the time a sort of a colleague and now the mayor, Regina Romero of Tucson, to work with community leaders to serve environmental food, and that's also part of a program that increases access to community gardens, school gardens, and we're looking at getting more involved with that at the school level to bring in community advocates and groups that are inherently aimed to help these communities, but also doing through seed provision, growing better gardens, and increasing kind of food sovereignty as well. So this is definitely something that's on our, and we're trying to handle this sensitively by being as involved as possible, but also having it be community driven. So we're listening to what the community need is and finding a way to be involved in that. And I think it's going to be starting with food banks and community gardens for now.
One thing, if I can just add to that, is this is a great example of where, again, it's both like policy and individual, because on the policy side, a lot of the things that Jennifer talked about, obviously the policies that created the food deserts are problematic, and there are positive policies such as increasing access to community gardens and urban agriculture and farmers markets. And there's a lot that we can do to make sure that fresh local food is more widely available. But there is also an individual piece as well, and an education piece. And there's really been this mythology that's been perpetrated that eating plant-based is somehow elitist, when the reality is that we see plant-based food driving cuisines in so many different diverse cultures. And there have been a number of studies out there that have looked at the difference between what if you followed the dietary guidelines according to the omnivore diet or as a vegetarian diet, and the vegetarian diet is significantly cheaper. Like, vegan food doesn't have to be expensive plant-based cheeses. Like a lot of times it comes down to balanced meals of beans and rice and vegetables and things that really are widely available everywhere. And so there's that individual piece of dispelling that myth, not just widely in terms of the narrative around sustainable eating, but also on that individual level. And some of that was integrated in the pilot program that Jennifer and I worked on in Tucson, where, you know, there was that combination of not just, you know, connecting with communities on community gardens, but also doing things like cooking demonstrations and teaching people about what are some of the local foods that really are widely accessible to people.
JP, how are your green beans doing? Are we ready to jump back over to you for a minute? Or
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what you were saying, Stephanie, the ingredients to make this are extremely low cost. So basically, we have a can of lentils, which is like $2, a can of tomatoes, which is like $1.50. So all in all, it's probably under $10. So the idea that veganism is somehow elitist, I also disagree with, and can attest I've probably saved thousands of dollars over the year eating a vegan diet. But yeah, so what we're going to do next is go ahead and put in these tomatoes, and I'm going to take a little bit of the juice out because I don't want too much juice in there. And again, you can do these with fresh tomatoes instead if you have them. This is just kind of the quick and dirty version, so to speak. So I'm just going to put these in. And then add about, 14 ounces of lentils. And again, I'm just using canned lentils because they're very convenient, but if you want to cook your own, that's awesome too. I'll drain this first. And yeah, so this is a fairly healthy meal. Green beans obviously have lots of vitamins, vitamin K, vitamin C, folates. Lentils have iron, lots of protein, fiber, very filling. And now I'm going to start adding some spices. Just grab a paper towel here. Okay. So one of the main spices I'm going to use is cumin. And I think it's roughly 2 teaspoons that I usually put in, but I'm just going to kind of go like this. Okay. I'm going to do this a little stir, start stirring this up. And I have this, I think I mentioned, on about medium heat, so not too hot. Turn this up a little. And freshly ground black pepper, definitely important here. Put in a bit of that. Okay, and then a little bit of garlic powder, because I love garlic. And then about a teaspoon of salt, roughly. And give that another stir. And then we're going to add about a 1/4 cup of red wine. And this gives it a very rich taste. And obviously, if you really like red wine, you can put more than a 1/4 cup. There we go. And then just give it another stir. So that is then going to cook for probably about 10 minutes. And that's really all there is to it. If you want even more protein, what you can do is add something like No Evil plant-based sausages. This is a really good brand that I love personally. There's other ones too as well. But obviously, even without this, it still has a lot of protein. And I like to add amaranth sometimes if you want more carbs, but just like that, it works too. So I'm just going to let that cook, and I guess we can do more questions.
Okay, thanks, JP. We'll check back in with you in about 10 minutes.
Sounds good.
Thank you. So 5 people are asking about fish. Can you talk about the impacts or sustainable options for fish-based diets?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that. The problems with overfishing are pretty well known, and that has, actually gotten quite a bit of attention. And there are some organizations that put out, seafood guides of which ones have, which specific types of fish have more or less impact than others. While in general, it is better to eat lower down on the food chain because fewer resources go into it, really, we like to emphasize that seafood is included when we're talking about this 50% reduction in animal products. Seafood is included in that. The oceans cannot sustain us continuing to eat high amounts of seafood, and a lot of people want to switch thinking that fish is a lower impact than other products like beef. A lot of people then start eating more fish, which will then cause more problems. And I know a lot of people bring up aquaculture, but the problem with aquaculture is that they're really just kind of wet factory farms. They run into a lot of the same problems. People don't think about the fact that the fish that are raised in aquaculture environments, they have to eat something. And that something is either going to be feed crops, which runs into a lot of the excessive use of land and water and pesticides that we've talked about earlier, or they are eating other fish, which again run into the fishing problems of how those fish are being harvested from the ocean. So again, it's one of those situations where there are better and worse scenarios, there are better and worse options, but really at the end of the day, none of it's going to be sustainable if we don't eat significantly less seafood and again, switch that over to eating more plant-based diets, because eating plants is the lowest you can get on the food chain, and it's going to have the lowest impact.
Thanks, Stephanie. Oh, Jennifer, go ahead.
I just want to add, there are guides, as Stephanie mentioned, and one of them is with partners through the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and they do have recommendations. And so we want to make sure that, as Stephanie said, we're keeping reduction in mind first and foremost. But one of the reasons is, and I think a lot of people don't know this, is that wide-scale overfishing includes bycatch, and bycatch means that those long fishing lines are not just catching the targeted species, but they're catching endangered species from whales to turtles as well. And so it isn't just a problem, again, of how much fish we're eating in terms of the fish themselves and the species, but their impact on other species as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. Stephanie, 3 people have specifically asked for the citation for the University of Michigan and Tulane study that you mentioned at the beginning.
Yes, actually, you can find that if you go to, I had mentioned that Appetite for Change guide that we created. That is at biologicaldiversity.org. And then it's under the Population and Sustainability Program under the food section. Within that policy guide, we actually have a summary of that research and a direct link to it. We helped support that research because we felt it was really important to really take a look at what different diet scenarios might look like a decade out from now. So you'll be able to find it there. And it's called the Implications of the Greenhouse Gas Emissions of Future Diet Scenarios in the US. And the lead author on it is Martin Heller.
Thank you. We have a question about dairy. Can you talk about how someone can eat eggs or dairy with the least possible impact? And are dairy products as impactful as eating meat?
Sure, I can start on that. And then Jennifer, I don't know if you want to hop in on that. Dairy is actually more impactful than a lot of other types of meat. It can depend on what it is that you eat, but realistically, a lot of people are eating, like when we look at the dairy market, we see a lot of people eating a lot of cheese. And that's where a lot of the government is helping to buy out surplus cheese. And cheese is a very high impact food because it's more condensed than just drinking a glass of milk. And because of that, it requires more resources. And of course, those resources, when we're talking about dairy, it's coming from cattle. And cattle, again, have they're responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane compared to other animals. They're big animals. They require a lot of feed, a lot of water to take care of them. There are a whole lot of inputs into dairy cattle. So if you're looking at, I mean, for one thing is look at where you can start to substitute out some dairy products. And again, for a lot of people, this has meant that it's easier for people to substitute out milk because there are a lot of options for plant-based milk. And that's great. And even if it starts with what you're putting in your coffee or what you're putting in your cereal, like start with that kind of substitution. But if you are looking toward, you know, to continue to include some dairy and eggs in your diet, I would definitely look towards, you know, looking at local small producers. Again, local, in addition to the problems that Jennifer mentioned, that it doesn't have quite the same, as much impact as reducing animal products. Local also is not a regulated label. So if you just see the word local, it could be a local factory farm that's 500 miles from your house. So really paying attention, you know, to your local producers and the farmers markets and understanding how big their operations are, and also, you know, whether they're organic, that can make a huge difference with dairy. You know, and what are some of their other practices? Talk to your local farmers. So if you can source locally, again, that can be more expensive. So reduction is oftentimes the best option there. You know, similarly with eggs, there are a lot of labels on eggs out there. It's kind of a mess. You can see things like natural or vegetarian eggs, and that doesn't mean anything. And even some of the more regulated labels like free range, there's a lot of wiggle room to what that can mean. So, you know, if you're able to talk to local producers, and if not, then really start to look for where are there substitutions and reductions that can be made.
So what will help drive the price of environmentally friendly options down?
A huge part of that is market demand. I mean, that's just kind of basic economics is, you know, we're already seeing this when it comes to plant-based meat, is the more people who are buying them, the bigger share that they have in the market, then the price tends to drop for them. You know, that's just the supply and demand trade-off. You know, and then there are, some of it is on the policy side, you know, and that's where we're working to, you know, really try to get more attention on the issues of subsidies and these government bailouts that are happening for meat and dairy producers and not for plant-based producers, and really trying to turn the tide on that so that more of that government money and support is going toward plant-based producers, and that, you know, animal agriculture and industrial livestock production in particular has to pay the true cost of production.
Can you talk about wild game and legally and ethically killed elk, and also touch on indigenous people in meat consumption? Because there's like a big difference in factory farmed meat and grocery store meat and like traditional buffalo hunts.
Jennifer, you want to field that one?
Yeah, that's a lot, and I don't know that I can adequately cover it in a few minutes, but it's a complicated issue. And when we're talking about factory farm reduction, you know, what we're talking about is not traditional culture reductions in practices as well. We're talking about these enormous CAFOs, factory farms, industrial scale agriculture, which are just a blight on the landscape. And so, you know, elk is an interesting issue, and we were just talking about dairy farms. And so I grew up in dairy country, and for example, you know, the county nearby in this that I'm thinking about is got working towards non-lethal predator control, which is a good step. But the dairies in this area, the ones that are remaining on the Point Reyes National Seashore, for example, are directly harming the Tula elk, and they're keeping them in exclosures from water. So those are native ungulates that are on public lands, and they're being harmed by livestock grazing and also from the dairy farms. So that's one relationship to elk. And then another, of course, is that the hunting of elk. And what we're talking about here in terms of meat reduction is scalability. This is not a scalable thing. Not everybody can go out and hunt game, but there are regions in the country where this is more of an option than going to the local market and purchasing something. So people have different cultural backgrounds that we respect and appreciate, and the solutions are not going to be the same for everybody, for sure. The number one problem impacting meat production is this large industrial scale approach to it.
Thanks, Jennifer. Let's go back over to JP. How's it going in your kitchen?
Good. So I think it's almost done. The one thing I forgot to add was just a little bit of cayenne pepper. So I'm just going to add a splash of that. And then I guess I'll just show you all what I'm doing over here. So yeah, it's basically, let's see if you can see that. Yeah, there's what we just made. And yeah, again, it's good with, if you need some like carbs to go with it, quinoa, brown rice, French bread, amaranth, something like that. The juice really will be sucked up by the rice or whatever. It'd be really tasty. So yeah, thanks for following along, and hope you can make it sometime.
Thanks, JP. That was very inspirational because I personally live on cereal and chips and salsa, so it was fun to watch you make that. People are asking for advice on how to guide the conversation with friends and family who eat meat to convince them to change.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and that's definitely a huge issue. You know, a few things to keep in mind with it is, you know, one is timing. If you are, you know, when we go back to a time when everybody's actually able to go out and eat, you know, once everybody has like already ordered their steaks or whatever, that's not the time to break out a lecture. I mean, just be realistic. Like, nobody is going to completely change what it is that they're eating before the bill comes at that point. You know, like just be realistic about the timing of it, and that can make a huge difference with the reception. I think it's really important not to like blame and shame people for their food choices, because as we said, like there are a lot of things that influence what people eat, and we didn't even get into all of these, like, you know, we didn't at least get deeply into all of like the cultural influences and the identity influences and people's understanding of health. And so there are a lot of reasons why people make the choices that they do. And so recognize that and try to steer clear of blame and shame. I found that one of the most effective things that you can do is to just really speak honestly and passionately about why you've made the decisions that you've made. And why it's important to you, the way that you're choosing to eat. And if, you know, whether that's eating completely plant-based or eating less meat and dairy, because when people understand that, I mean, these are people who care about you. And so they'll respect, you know, your perspective and where you're coming from. And it's something that they'll take more seriously than they might if it's coming just from a news article that they see. And then the other big thing, and of course, this is again where JP's recipe comes in, is showing them is huge. You know, cooking for people, bringing plant-based items to family gatherings and to potlucks, and sharing your favorite recipes and those things. I mean, really, when it comes to eating, one of the biggest things is just people feeling like it's something that tastes really good and that's something possible for them to do. I mean, those are really the greatest factors, you know, when it comes to people not just choosing to try new things, but then sustaining a different way of eating.
I would add that just the experience is the best way, you know, like, rather than getting into an argument with people, just bring a meal. You don't have to tell them what it is necessarily, but allowing them to experience something that's delicious it's the thing that changes everybody's mind. And then just modeling it. You know, I have friends that are ranchers, I have friends that are vegans, I have friends that are hunters, I have friends, everybody in between. And, you know, my diet is my message that I generally promote is just by making really good food. And if people like it, then that can help. And if people don't like it, you know, I'll make something else and I'll try again. And then I can make the connection between the wildlife. Everybody loves wildlife. We all love beautiful places, and we kind of start with that commonality.
So what about companion animals, dogs and cats, and carbon footprints? 3 people have asked about that. I know we're almost out of time, but do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I can talk briefly about that. Yes, companion animals eat a lot of meat. Cats in particular, I know that there are some vegan foods on the market, but cats are obligate carnivores. Dogs, in theory, can eat a vegan diet, but as I can attest personally for my own dogs, a lot of times they have health problems that don't make that possible. So it is a reality that our companion animals eat meat, but recognize that there's one study that estimated that companion animals were responsible for about 25 to 30% of the environmental footprint of animal agriculture. But one big factor to keep in mind is, even though there is a ton of like boutique pet foods out there, that the majority of the meat that's going into animal foods is meat that people won't choose to eat. I mean, they're not getting like the prime cuts. So a lot of times the animal food winds up being a byproduct of the human food market. And so even as we reduce animal agriculture, those byproducts will still be available for our companion animals. But, one of the things to keep in mind is, even when we can't change our companion animals' diets, we can change our own diets. And to me, like, that's another motivator that, my animals have to eat meat. So I keep that in mind when it comes to what it is that I'm eating, as well as some of the other choices that I make. And we can also, with our companion animals, you can look at, are there places where you can maybe cut back their meat in terms of their treats? Some of them really like plant-based treats, even if their main diet needs to be, based in animal products. So it is a reality of what we're living with, but also, the main part of the market, it's still on us. It's still on the meat and dairy and other animal products that humans are eating.
Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to share with us today. And thank you at home for joining us. Next week's webinar is going to be on Wednesday. It's Mobilize for the Wild, and they're going to talk about organizing to end wildlife trade. Wildlife trade is a major driver of extinction, and it's also a threat to public health, as we're all experiencing right now. So they're going to do a deep dive on how you can organize to make a difference. Then the week after that, on June 11th, we're going to talk about plastic production and the fossil fuel industry and why they're pushing plastic production and the harm that has on human communities and marine life. So we hope to see you there, and thank you for joining us. Take care.